He knew perfectly well that that pandemic did not start in a market in Wuhan, and yet he chose to tell the world the opposite. He 111 times said that I plead the fifth and can't say anything. He urged them to write a paper saying the very opposite, and yet when it came out he pretended he knew nothing about it and didn't even know the authors. The Wuhan lab was being funded by his own agency, and they have a database which records all the viruses they've got, and they won't share it.
I think if people were to know that, they would go slightly nuts about it. So give us a sense of what you think is at stake in relation to science and in relation to public trust more broadly.
Well, I think the COVID pandemic delivered a series of torpedoes into the hull of trust in science. But I don't find that the scientific establishment appreciates what they themselves have done.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Matt Ridley. Matt, welcome to the show.
Brendan, good afternoon. Nice to see you.
Great to have you back on. There's a lot I want to ask you about, but we've got to kick off with Fauci. I mean, everyone in the world is talking about Anthony Fauci again, having spoken about him at length during the COVID pandemic and the lockdown mania. He's been giving evidence, or not been giving evidence, we should say, at a hearing in the US. You wrote a brilliant piece about it for Spiked. I want to dig into that and some of the points that you made, but firstly, I just want to ask you what you thought about his appearance. He famously or infamously pleaded the fifth, so he didn't say much at all. I think even some of his fans might have been a bit put off by that. What did you think when you saw him there basically saying nothing?
Well, because he 111 times said that I plead the fifth and can't say anything, we learnt nothing much from the hearing. But we learnt an awful lot from what Rand Paul released in the days before the hearing, which was, first of all, lots of emails and Slack messages, and secondly, Anthony Fauci's private diary. Now, he says it's a private diary, but he kept it on the NIH servers. He used NIH staff to make entries into it, and he tried to email it to himself at home, and something went wrong, and it ended up in the hands of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who leaked it to Rand Paul. And in thousands of pages going back 20 or 30 years of this man who was the highest paid federal employee of any, who was in the same job for 38 years, 1 year longer than J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI, which is an unbelievably long time to leave someone in one job, by the way, who's on a $400,000 pension. And what's gripping about the diary is that he is completely obsessed with his own celebrity and with the other celebrities he meets, to the exclusion of almost everything else, including the deaths of millions of people in COVID. Not exclusion, but to the downplaying. And get this, he got himself nominated for 8 big prizes, cash prizes, right? And the way he did that was to write, either directly or through one of his assistants, to some of the scientists who were getting huge grants from his agency, saying, will you nominate me for a prize? So one of them, this Dan something prize, was $900,000. And the chap who was asked by him directly to nominate him for the prize had a $200 million grant from his agency. Now, I mean, it doesn't come more blatant than that. This was a fiefdom being run by a mafia don, as far as one can make out. However, I just want to add that all of that is much less important in the long run than the fact that the diaries and the messages show that he knew perfectly well from the last week of January 2020 that pandemic did not start in a market in Wuhan, and probably may well have started in a laboratory, and yet he chose to tell the world the opposite. And for me, that's the shocking thing, is to tell the world something that's convenient for yourself but untrue, and to be untrue.
Yeah, that's really what I want to get into with you now. But I have to say that the stuff about his celebrity is extraordinary. I mean, this is a man who was in love with himself. You, in your piece for us, you quote the part of his diary where he says, "I think I might be the most famous man in the world." I mean, just at extraordinary levels of self-regard. Really funny to see. But let's talk about not just self-regard, but self-deceit. So as you say, this is a man who was at the forefront in many ways of publicly poo-pooing the idea that this was a potentially lab-born virus and rather must have started naturally. And his diary shows that privately, very early on, he was thinking the opposite. He was mulling over the possibility that it was from a lab. How deep does he go into that in his diary? What exactly does he say that gives the sense that behind the scenes he might have been thinking something very different to what he was saying publicly?
Well, he says very explicitly, I gather it now, we now think it didn't start in the wet market. And he says that in January 2020, as I said. Now, he didn't repeat that in the public. He then says to his subordinates, we desperately need to look things up urgently to check what's gone on here. And what he's referring to, of course, is that the Wuhan lab was being funded by his own agency, the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And that's clear. But he then says things like, let's communicate on public email about this. So we don't know the full story. But we also know that he organized this meeting on the 1st of February with a dozen virologists. I think there were either 12 or 14 in the room, and all but 2 of them said a lab leak now looks quite likely. And instead of coming out and saying that, he urged them to write a paper saying the very opposite. He midwifed that paper. He edited that paper. He sponsored that paper. He lent on the journal to publish that paper. And yet when it came out, he pretended he knew nothing about it and didn't even know the authors. He should have been a co-author on the paper. So there's that element of it that's pretty shocking. But what I think is also very surprising is the degree to which he, pushed the other organs of the American government in particular and the World Health Organization into shutting down the lab leak theory as much as possible. He lent on the CIA. We've got evidence for that from his journals and messages. He shut Robert Redfield of the Centers for Disease Control out of the conversation. He was instrumental within the White House. He was leaning on the World Health Organization. He was trying to negotiate with Jeremy Farrar's help of the Wellcome Trust access to China for the World Health Organization. And the quid pro quo for that was, if we shut down the lab leak, will you let us in to talk about it? To talk about what's going on and how to manage the pandemic. That seems to have been the bargain they were trying to strike. And really, that's quite shocking, I think, because what we're looking at is the deaths of 20 million, something like that, people, and a complete discombobulation of all our lives. And that means that just in terms of deaths, let alone everything else, this was 100 times as bad as Chernobyl, Bhopal, and 9/11 put together. And yet, where is the demand for transparency from this? Now, I have to say, there's part of me that says, let's get too hung up on Anthony Fauci, because there is an American tendency to make this all about the American end of it. The Americans did not start the pandemic. They developed the technologies and they sent the money to Wuhan for starting the pandemic, but it was a Chinese lab that did it. And to some extent, the focus on Fauci is letting Xi Jinping and Xi Zhengli, who was the head of the key lab in question, and a number of other key people in China, off the hook.
Yeah, it's a very good point that you make in your piece for us as well. I want to look a bit more broadly at the lab leak question, but if you'll forgive me for sticking with Fauci for one more moment, I did want to ask you what you think drove that, because to me it just sounds straight up dishonest, possibly even corrupt, the way in which these people were behaving, the way in which they were saying one thing, doing another, seemingly covering things up or hiding the truth or making the truth more difficult for people to ascertain. What do you think was the motor for that? Is it because his own institution, as you say, was involved in funding Wuhan and therefore was, in some ways involved in this global historic scandal? Is that the reason? What do you think drove the levels of dishonesty we saw early on in the pandemic?
I think there's three key things. One is the funding. As you say, he became aware at the end of January that his agency had been funding the experiments in Wuhan, as well as the experiments in North Carolina that developed the technology that was used in Wuhan. So he knew that his financial fingerprints were all over it. The second thing is that he had promoted and defended that whole line of research for a very long time, for more than a decade. Gain of function was an active and controversial topic in the early 2010s, and he came out very strongly saying, no, we must do it, even if it leads to some deaths, because it could be very useful in finding out how viruses work. So he was well aware that his own words would come back to bite him if it became clear that this was a result of this kind of research. But the third thing that I think you need to take into account is the fact that we're talking about January, February 2020. None of us at that point thought we were in for a global pandemic that would last more than 2 years. Most of us thought this would stay in China, maybe a few outbreaks elsewhere, like SARS did. SARS got to Toronto and Hong Kong, but it didn't really blow up anywhere else. And then it was brought under control. And like Ebola and like Hanta and like Nipah, these outbreaks, they happen and then we work out how to stop them and then we stop them. So they thought the whole story would blow over in a month or two. And that was why I think they felt they could keep a lid on this until it had blown over. It never entered their minds that 6 years later, people like you and me would be discussing what they wrote in their private diaries and messages at that time. So I think that became the problem. They became a captive of their own carelessness. And it's not just him. The other scientists involved in this were sending the most extraordinary messages to each other at this time. Their own carelessness about saying, yeah, it's probably one thing, even though we're saying the opposite in public, and we've got to shut down so-and-so, we've got to call them a conspiracy theorist to try and stop them talking about this, that kind of stuff, which they wouldn't have done if they were thinking, maybe 5 years down the line, this stuff's going to be discussed in Congress. Do you see what I mean? So I think one has to bear in mind the thought process that it was probably going to be a short thing.
Yeah. I remember walking around London in January 2020, knowing about this Chinese flu or whatever we were calling it, but having no idea that it would become the global phenomenon that it did. I want to ask you a pretty basic question, I guess, which is, what is the status right now of the lab leak theory? I mean, everything I know about the lab leak theory, I know through your excellent work, and I'm very happy to have you as my main source of information. What is the standing of it in terms of, I guess, global discussion? Is it now accepted as a distinct possibility by more people? Is it still being denied? Is it still being treated as a conspiracy theory by some? What is the kind of moral standing of that idea?
The vast majority of the public think it happened. I get that very clearly from all sorts of directions, and I think it's true and you can see it in polling evidence. Yeah, slightly more people in the Republican Party than the Democrat Party think it happened, etc. But the majority of people all across the spectrum, the political spectrum, think there was a lab leak. The exception, though, is the scientific establishment, who have managed to resist this altogether, even though most of them in private think it's the case. I mean, I hear all the time from biologists who say, keep going, you're on the right track, but I daren't say so for the sake of my career. So Science magazine, Nature magazine, the Royal Society, the National Academy in America, none of them will even discuss it. It's not that they think they've got strong arguments against it. They daren't discuss it. I mean, Nature and Science, every now and then they run an article saying, oh, look, there might have been a raccoon dog in the market. We don't know whether it was infected, but it might have been there. I mean, pathetic papers get rushed through publication to try and prop up the market theory long after the Chinese and Anthony Fauci and everyone else have decided the market theory won't run, that dog won't hunt, but they keep trying to revive it. So for me, that's the shocking thing. If you really believe, as the editor of Nature or Science appears to believe, that it did not start in a lab, then get out there and make the case. Have a debate. Invite people, you don't have to invite me, invite scientists like Alina Chan or Stephen Quay or someone like that get a big public forum, hammer it out, really go into it. Put articles in journals, pro and con, because if you think that it's wrong, you need to be putting the public back on the right track, because the public is on the wrong track as far as you're concerned. They think it was a lab leak. Why are you so uninterested, in trying to persuade them? And that, for me, is quite a giveaway sign. So that's about the status of it. But what do we know? Well, we know they were doing experiments on exactly this kind of virus in that lab and pretty well nowhere else in the world, certainly not to the level that they were doing it. We know they were bringing viruses from more than 1,000 miles away to that lab and to nowhere else. We know they were particularly interested in 2017, 18, and 19 for the first time in viruses that were 20% different from SARS itself. This one is. We know that they defrosted and sequenced one of those viruses, the one that is 96% the same as COVID, in 2018. We know that they had a proposal to put a particular genetic sequence into such a virus in 2018, which turned up in COVID and has never been seen in about 800 other SARS-CoV viruses ever to this day. So that's pretty weird. The coincidence is truly extraordinary. It's on a par with that Armstrong and Miller sketch about, plotting to murder Princess Diana with a drunk chauffeur, and then, it happened anyway. Isn't that lucky? And what we don't know, though, is which viruses they were particularly working on in 2017, 18, and 19. They've never told us, and they won't tell us. We know what they were working on before that, but they won't. We know which ones what type of virus they were trying to, and it's exactly the right kind, but we don't know which ones they actually worked on. And we don't know which experiments they actually did. And they have a database which records all the viruses they've got, and they won't share it. I mean, why not? If it exonerates them, get it out there and show us.
Yeah, the lack of the unwillingness to come forward either with arguments for the wet market theory or with evidence for what was going on. I mean, that's a tell in and of itself. The evidence, as you've laid out here and you've laid out in your book and lots of the writing you've been doing, is extraordinary. I find it incredibly persuasive. I'm sure other people do as well. I wanted to ask you, we've talked about this before, but I wanted to return to the question of what's at stake in relation to all of this, because every now and then I read something about the lab leak theory, or the thought of it crosses my mind, and it kind of slightly blows my mind, because when I think about what's at stake in relation to trust in science, but not only trust in science, trust in government. I mean, if people were across the facts on how deceptive this discussion has been, how unwilling scientists have been to be upfront and to falsify information or to prove their case or to have the argument in public. I think if people were to know that, they would go slightly nuts about it. So give us a sense of what you think is at stake in relation to science and in relation to public trust more broadly.
Well, I think the COVID pandemic delivered a series of torpedoes into the hull of trust in science. But the one that blew up the magazine was this one, as it were, if you get my metaphor, which is perhaps not a very appropriate metaphor, but there we are. You're absolutely right that very many wonderful scientists that I know feel very aggrieved that the public doesn't trust them as much as it used to. And they think the answer is to get out there and lecture the public and tell them to stop being so silly and get back on board, when I think the answer is to say, you know what, we screwed up. We allowed some really stupid experiments that had very little upside and massive downside to happen. And then we went out and covered up for them. And mea culpa, we really shouldn't have done that. Here's the mechanisms we're going to set up to regain public trust in science and make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again. Is that okay with you, Mr. Public? Now, if they did that, I think they've got a chance. But otherwise, I'm sorry. I've spent my whole career championing science, defending science. I love science. I think it's humanity's greatest achievement. I think it's better than Beethoven and Shakespeare put together. I know that makes me a Philistine, but I do think that, the double helix and deep geological time and the universe and relativity, these are incredible things. So I don't want the public to lose trust in science, but I don't find that the scientific establishment appreciates what they themselves have done to blow up their own reputations.
Yeah, I think that's becoming increasingly clear. Just one more question on this issue before I move on to a couple of other things. What do you think is the likelihood of having a reckoning with all of this stuff? I mean, we've seen the Fauci spectacle. He basically just pleaded the fifth constantly. It felt kind of frustrating, although, as you say, loads of information came out in the document dump. That was very useful, and people will talk about that for a long time. But it felt frustrating, and to me, it was almost indicative of a kind of silence, or a culture of silence, or a culture of fear potentially around that whole period, around COVID, around lockdown. I'm sure you've heard that some people are now theorizing on lockdown amnesia, which is where people kind of have these memory holes for that period. They can't quite remember all the things that happened during lockdown, which makes sense in a way, because we forge memories when we socially interact, and there were fewer opportunities for that. And of course, lots of us want to forget what happened because it was unpleasant. When I speak to normal friends of mine and family members, they very rarely speak about lockdown. People always will have a trip down memory lane and say, do you remember this? Do you remember that? But it's like this 1.5 year period, which is just a black hole. People, you and I think about it, and lots of other people talk about it, but I have a feeling there are lots of people out there who have kind of repressed the memory, and for some reason they don't really want to grapple with it. What's your sense of that? And what do you think is the likelihood of that at some point we will have a genuine social reckoning with the things that were done, with the mistakes that were made, with the lies that were told? Do you have hope that will happen?
Well, I know what you mean, and I share your frustration with it. And I come across this all the time, that, oh, do you really want to go back over all that? Isn't that over? And of course, it happens to the lab leak too. And the number of people who say to me, surely we're never going to find out, so what's the point in looking, is frustrating also. And my response to that has always been, look what happened with the anthrax leak in Sverdlovsk in 1979. It took us 12 years, but eventually we got the truth. It took regime change in the Soviet Union to get at the truth, but we got there. So don't give up hope of finding out what actually happened. And I think also there is some comfort in the fact that if this were to start again now, despite not having faced up to it, I don't think our political class would lock down again in the same ridiculous way that they did. So I think lessons are quietly being learned, and I'm pretty sure that experiments of the stupidest kind are not being funded. But there's no real mechanism for either monitoring or being transparent about what experiments are being funded in these kinds of labs. And if anything, the discussion of, I do a certain amount of archaeology on what people were saying about lab leaks before the pandemic. And you've got all sorts of very excellent speeches and papers being written from the World Health Organization and others saying the risk of a lab leak is now getting quite high because of all the experiments we're doing on viruses, and we need to watch this, and they won't say that now. because if they think that if they say that now, it's admitting that this one was a lab leak, and they don't want to admit that. So there's a real danger that we will sleepwalk into another pandemic. As I've always said, the biggest risk we're running at the moment, and I think it's a bigger risk than nuclear war and climate change and anything else you care to mention, is that somewhere on the planet there are bad actors, whether they're in Tehran or Pyongyang or somewhere else, I don't know, who are saying, that was interesting. You can bring the world to its knees with a few microbiologists, and all these reagents and nucleotide assembly machines can be ordered off the internet, and nobody's tracking them. We could have a bit of fun here. Now, I don't want to go into that in too much detail in case your Pyongyang audience is watching and picks up a few tips. But do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's an incredibly important point. And the lack of discussion or openness around this issue just exacerbates that possibility that people will certain actors will rub their hands with glee at the possibility of bringing the world to a standstill again. Matt, I want to ask you about another issue related to science, an issue close to your heart and mine as well, which is the issue of climate change. What's going on there? It's very hot in the UK. It has been for the past few weeks. We haven't had rain for a long time. And it's given rise to the kind of discussion that it always gives rise to, which is that, some people are saying it's hell on earth. It's a man-made calamity. This is proof that Britain is being propelled into a tropical future that we're not ready for. Usual kind of discussion. What have you made of the discussion around this very hot summer and what it tells us about the state of this debate more broadly?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, yes, of course, it is a very hot summer, and it's a pretty record-breaking one in various ways. Although I'm old enough to remember summer of 1976, and that was pretty similar, really, particularly if you take into account urbanization around thermometers and things like that. So it's not a massive change on the kind of summer we were able to have even in a much cooler time. But yes, we are in a period of global warming. You should expect warmer summers. In fact, if you look at the data, it's winters that are warming faster than summers. And so global warming is probably saving lives on net rather than killing people on net. Zach Polanski was talking about 3,000 people dead as a result of this heat wave. That may be true, but there's more than that die every winter as a result of cold. And the fact that we have mild winters these days means that fewer people are dying. So you do have to look at both sides of that balance sheet. Also, it's quite interesting that this has actually been a record cold summer in most of the Arctic. Now, that might be connected with the fact that it's been record hot here, because the hot air here hasn't been getting up to the Arctic and dissipating up there, and the cold air from there hasn't been coming down to cool down our summer, sort of thing. So you do have to look at the global picture. And Western Europe has had a particularly savagely hot summer. There's no doubt about it. And what do we learn from that? We learned that, we're in a period of global warming, so we're going to get more hot summers. So let's adapt to it. Let's buy some air conditioners. Let's manage the vegetation on heathland, which tends to catch fire too easily. Let's build some more reservoirs. That's the argument we should be having, not, do we really think that if we'd eaten fewer cows and built more wind farms, that we wouldn't have had this hot summer now? That's not a practical approach to the problem.
Yeah, I find the reluctance, especially around the air conditioning discussion. Whenever I say let's have an aircon revolution in the United Kingdom, people think that you're covering up the truth about global warming or you're putting a band-aid on the problem, when in fact it's an entirely reasonable and important suggestion to make alongside the other ones that you've suggested too. What have you made about the apocalyptic discussion around it? I mean, in some ways there hasn't been as much apocalyptic discussion as there was maybe a couple of years ago when there was also hot weather. I'm not sure that the UN has come out with its statement about global boiling as it did a couple of years ago, and it said we've moved from global warming to global boiling, and you wonder what can come next. But there has been apocalyptic discussion. There has been this idea that this is just a complete disaster and we've all got to go back to the caves to save ourselves. It's been a fairly typical discussion, but do you think there's any possibility of a reasonable discussion cutting through that stuff at any point?
Well, we're speaking in Britain, and Britain is still very much enthralled to the climate Armageddon people. Remember, the argument is not between whether climate change is changing or whether it isn't. It's between whether it's relatively minor problem compared with other problems in the world, or a massive existential apocalyptic problem. And we're still enthralled to the idea that it is an existential threat, mostly in this country. Officially, parish councils or cricket clubs are sort of by law required to take into account, I may have made it up about cricket clubs, but that kind of organization, that climate change is a threat to their future. If you were in America, it would be a very different conversation now, not only because they aren't having a ridiculously hot summer, it's pretty hot in places, but it's not off the graph, but also because a lot of the air has gone out of the balloon over there. And that's partly because of Trump, but not really. Trump is a symptom, not a cause of this, because he sniffs the wind and knows which way the opinion is going. And his opponents are not talking about climate much anymore either. And people like Bill Gates have downgraded some of the funding of climate alarm, and nobody's much, doing the Al Gore sort of the sky is falling act over there anymore. And the tech industry, interestingly, which was all in for, oh my God, climate change, we need to be we need to emote about it. They're now saying, oh, help, we need to build data centers. And for that, we need gas because nuclear isn't ready and solar doesn't work at night. So we really need gas. So we better go easy on hydrocarbons in order to get our data centers up and running. I caricature, but you get the point. So I do think it's worth looking across, because a lot of our existential threat stuff came from America originally. And so I think it is worth looking across there and seeing what's coming our way, just as the Gulf Stream blows air our way. So ideas tend to come from that direction. And I think, the funding for climate alarm and the political will for it is not what it is. And I forecast that if the Democrats win the midterms this year and maybe even the presidential election in 2 years' time, yes, they'll try and talk up climate change and renewable energy a bit more, but I don't think it's going to be quite like what it was. I think the time is gradually coming when all of us, including in Britain and Europe, are going to talk about getting used to and adapting to the fact that we're living in a warming trend, and there's various things happening, including, by the way, a massive greening effect. Carbon dioxide is having a much bigger effect on the quantity of green vegetation on the planet than it is on the temperature of the planet. That's much more measurable, much more certain scientifically, by the way. And so, I do see a gradual return to a more moderate conversation about this, which would please me. But it's time we did it, because I've been writing about climate change in a steadily less alarmed way for more than 40 years now.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I have felt that the climate change lunacy has been defanged to a certain extent. And I think the way you've explained it, it puts it very well. You can also see it in all the eco-lunatics in the UK who now seem to be putting their energies into the Gaza question. They found another apocalyptic scenario they can obsess over instead.
Well, Greta Thunberg literally went from one to the other.
Yeah. They've gone from an eco-apocalypse that never happened to a genocide that never happened. I think that's the way I understand it. Matt, my final question for you, just on this theme, and I guess the broader question of Britain's future. What do you make of the Andy Burnham era? I mean, not Andy Burnham as an individual, unless you want to tell us what you think about him, but in relation to the energy question, is Britain going to come to its senses on the energy question? Are we going to become properly energy independent? You know, seems to be some confusion over whether Andy Burnham is more willing than Keir Starmer was to drill in the North Sea or not. How do you see that stuff going in terms of net zero drilling, you know, coming back to our senses on the energy issue?
Well, Labour has not come to its senses on it, and it is still arguing that unreliable energy is cheaper as well as more secure than hydrocarbons, and that just isn't true. You know, I mean, it is no accident that we have the highest industrial and electricity prices in the world, or in the developed world, I should say. And we are destroying our industries with that, our chemical, our steel, our cars, our pharmaceutical, our data, our AI industries, etc. You know, you cannot be a thriving modern economy with the highest energy prices in the world. It just doesn't make sense. So reality is going to come at some point, whatever Ed Miliband and his successor think. It just is a question of how long it takes for reality to break through. At least we are allowed now to have a conversation between the parties about this, because that's what was so depressing 10 years ago when I was a lonely voice in the House of Lords on this, saying that renewable energy was causing high prices and low reliability and so on. The Tories were as bad as Labour on this, and the Lib Dems were even worse. And the Greens, of course, would, if anyone noticed them at all, were the worst of the lot. So the Uni Party was a huge problem. On energy, we now at least have an excellent Tory leader in Kemi Badenoch saying all the right things. And Claire Coutinho, her shadow energy minister, is I think, terrific on this. I don't think she was a very good energy minister, but she's a very good energy shadow minister, if you see what I mean. So that has to be a good thing, that we're able to have a conversation. And that will make it hard for Andy Burnham to keep the show on the road as far as the energy policy is concerned. Whether it takes 6 months or 6 years for the chickens to come home to roost on that, I don't know. But for me, it is the central issue, much more important than everything else, because in the end, the economy is a thermodynamic phenomenon. You inject energy into our daily lives in order to change our lives for the better. That's what we do with, there's a rather good new book by Richard Lyon coming out, pointing out, he says that money in the end is just a token telling you how much energy you're going to have in future, or how affordable it's going to be, and so on. So I do think that energy is the absolutely central issue that we need to really good conversation about in the next few months and years.
Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan.